Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. Our series today, our first of a three-part series today, is the human factor. And again, thank you for joining. As we head into autumn, the CMG Express web series turns inward as we temporarily move away from the physical and the administrative side of condominium industry and focus on the most important element of our community, its people. This is a three-part series in which we will touch on personal mental wellness management, as well as working collaboratively with a variety of personalities. Directors will come to the understanding of the resources available, with mental health playing an important role in condominium operations. This webinar is the first of a three-part series. It's being offered exclusively to directors and communities that we service. I'm Shelley Seeby, the Resource Compliance Manager at CMG, and I'm pleased to be your moderator for this session. So let me take this time to introduce our two guests this afternoon. We have Gerry Bourdeau, who is a condominium manager with CMG, and we also have Colm Brannigan, online dispute resolution. Gerry Bourdeau is a licensed general license manager with condominium, the Condominium Management Regulatory Authority of Ontario. That's a mouthful. Additionally, Gerry has achieved several certifications in the field of condominium and community association management. He is a registered condominium manager, an RCM, with ACMO. Which is the Association of Condominium Managers of Ontario. He is also a certified manager of condominium associations, CMCA, and an association management specialist as designated by the Condominium Association of Managers International Certification. Gerry also comes to the table with quite a bit of experience with mediation and also has a certification in mediation for professionals. He has quite a few different strengths in the realm of mediation and negotiation. And Gerry, I'd like to welcome you today.
Thanks, Shelley. Just to clarify too, I have experience with informal mediation. Colm's the guy with the formal mediation experience. So
and that's a good lead into our poll that we have later on for our attendees today. Our second guest is Colm Brannigan. Colm has been a mediator and an arbitrator for over 20 years, based in the GTA area, but Colm has an Ontario-wide ADR practice, focusing on a broad range of commercial, condominium, employment, estate, real estate, and land use disputes. Colm is a fellow of the Chartered Institute of Arbitrators and is both a chartered mediator and a chartered arbitrator through the ADR Institute of Canada. Among Colm's many achievements, he is also the first person to have received the new chartered mediator designation from ADRIC. Colm, you'll have to go into that acronym afterwards. Colm is also acknowledged expert in development of online dispute resolution and the mediation arbitration processes. He frequently speaks at many continued education webinars, programs, and conferences in Canada. So you might recognize Colm today. Again, welcome very much to the webinar today, Colm.
Thanks very much, Shelley.
So let's just jump right into it. So we have quite a few people that have actually taken part in informal conflict resolution methods, which is great. And we will get into both informal and formal conflict resolution techniques. So Gerry, we'll start with you today. Let's use a scenario. The board of directors, move it ahead. So the board of directors is meeting, and on the agenda is an issue of a non-compliant situation that concerns a homeowner. So for example, a new homeowner has moved in and has installed a large gazebo in their exclusive use backyard. The rules clearly state that the installation of a structure must be approved prior to putting it into your exclusive use backyard. So Gerry, walk us through, what are the reasonable steps to communicate with the homeowner and to navigate the situation with your board of directors?
Okay, so thanks, Shelley. So in this instance, we have a unit owner who's new, but I think this would probably apply to really any unit owner. You have a potential for a conflict here. There might be a conflict, and we're not really sure yet, I guess, at this point, because we haven't reached out to the unit owner. But let's say in this directors meeting, you're going to have different personalities. So different boards have different ways of thinking about things. And some of them might want to have that gazebo removed immediately, where others might want to have a polite letter sent and others a not so polite letter sent. My suggestion would be that a lot of times the condo manager is, while not perhaps truly neutral, because we are paid by the condo, we're often the most neutral party available. And part of our job really is to carry out the duties of the condo corporation reasonably, which is a word I want to keep returning to today, and to sort of act like a conflict resolution tool so that we don't have the condo entangled in something worse. So for something simple like this gazebo, at least initially it might look simple, I would suggest a polite communication to the unit owner explaining the rules, but not in an accusatory way, perhaps. Inviting them to reply about the gazebo. Maybe they have perhaps a gazebo might be more of an example of something that might be considered frivolous in many cases, but maybe there is something that you've not thought about the gazebo as to why they need it. There are other instances of rule breaking where it's not going to be something frivolous, and there might even be a human rights accommodation that's required. So I think the condo manager would initially want to gather information in as impartial a way as possible, and basically advise the board to hold off making any judgments about the situation until all the information was in and we even know what the unit owner is thinking.
And it, like you had mentioned, the condo manager in many cases should be kind of the neutral party here. So like you do have to open it up to look at all factors. So is it an issue of, and again, the gazebo is a pretty simplified, I guess, example to use, but if somebody is installing, had gone right ahead and installed a railing on in front of a townhouse community, it may not be just for aesthetics. It could be actually an issue of accessibility.
Right, or maybe, hey, this unit owner keeps parking near the line in their parking space. Well, I mean, perhaps the person is unable to get out of their vehicle because of, some condition they have. We really don't know. So I guess reasonableness, again, is what I want to come back to, Shelley.
And not jumping to conclusions, that's for sure.
Exactly.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Colm, what would be it may not be this example, but in general, what are some of the reasonable steps to enforce compliance?
Well, I think Gerry set out the most important one, which is don't jump to conclusions without getting the information. Many conflicts and disputes, and a dispute is when a conflict kind of simmers along and then it becomes a dispute. So in this situation, while you're getting the information, there's a potential conflict. If it becomes a dispute, it'll be over whether you're allowed to have the gazebo or not. And of course, as Gerry said, there could be all kinds of other issues there. So the first thing will be to write to the unit owner, and I think Gerry already mentioned that. And this letter should be inviting compliance. It should not, at least at that stage, demand compliance. Over the years, I've seen a lot of letters coming from property managers and from lawyers. And the property managers' letters tend to be ones that they've used for a while, and it's a precedent letter, but they tend to be quite technical, and they tend to be quite demanding in terms of, you know, the declaration and bylaws X, Y, Z. But many people haven't seen those, even though, yes, they got them when they bought their house or their apartment. Quite frankly, because real estate lawyers don't have the time, nor do people want to pay them to go through all the documents, because every condo is different. People often arrive without knowing what's going on and what their obligations are. So the first thing you do is, you know, in Gerry's case, I mean, yeah, communicate with them. So you might want to start off by talking to them. Then you send them a letter, and then you basically escalate from that. So the first letter should be inviting, because what we want here is we want to pull people into compliance, not push them. Because if you push, you get a reaction. So we try and show people, you know, you may not know that there's a rule or a bylaw, and, you know, be happy to talk to you about it, because we need you to comply with it. So you would do that a couple of times, maybe even 3. And the only reason I say 3 is because that's a standard in employment law when people give progressive discipline, and I think it's probably worth doing. At that stage, if the person's ignoring you or has basically said, look, I'm not taking it down, I don't care, then you should be talking to your lawyer. The lawyer will send a letter, and you should encourage your lawyer to send an inviting letter as well, because quite frankly, some of the letters that are sent, you know, they really are harsh. And I don't know about everyone here, but if you get a harsh letter, you're not likely to feel that you should go along with it. So again, the lawyers would probably spend 1 or 2 letters, and then you have to decide, what are you going to do? As a board, you have an obligation as directors to, you know, uphold the act, the declaration, the bylaws, the rules, everything else. So how important is this? If it's something that you really see as being crucial to the you know, running of your community, then you would look at the options. In a case like this, you're probably looking at the mandatory mediation and arbitration provisions of the Condominium Act. So mediation is just a facilitated negotiation. And Gerry would have already done this as the property manager. He would have had a discussion perhaps between a director and the owner, where he would facilitate it and act as a mediator. And that's a role the property managers in the last wee while have come more to see as being a key part of their you know, obligations to professionally run the complex or whatever setup the condo is for the benefit of the owners. And one thing to keep in mind around compliance, compliance is extremely important, but it has to be reasonable. And you have to look at the culture of your community. And if we believe that condos are communities, then we don't jump from, you know, in this case, take the gazebo down to trying to go to court without taking other steps. And a good reason for that is that that's really what the Act calls for. You have a duty to enforce compliance, but you do not have to go to the ultimate extreme. Reasonableness is what's important. And where that will become really important is if you do go into the formal process of mediation. If that's not successful, then you arbitrate. In arbitration, the arbitrator makes a decision for you. It's very expensive. And the issue of costs come up. So the condo usually wants its costs, and then often the condo wins because the condo has the paper and the people have to comply. But on costs, mediators and courts look at how a condo behaved. How did they try and de-escalate? You know, and also, you know, the cost, there has to be proportionality here. And it's interesting, the gazebo one, because I actually had an example of one where it turned out there was a human rights issue. The owner had vitiligo, which is a disease with, can be very, very serious because you essentially lose the pigmentation in your skin. And therefore you can, you know, not be able to sit outside, things like that. So they were looking for an accommodation. At first, people didn't know that. and there was a fair amount of hostility. But once that was talked about, then there was a solution. And often the solution is a pathway towards compliance rather than immediate compliance. So you really have to take a common sense, reasonableness approach. Don't just say, oh, the declaration of rules say X, therefore we'll do whatever we have to come to X. Listen to the advice you get from your property manager, listen to the advice you get from your lawyers. In many cases, especially a number of years ago, many of the mediations I was involved with should never have got to mediation. And they wouldn't have if there had been a conversation between the property manager, the board, and the unit owner. So reasonableness is, I think, kind of like beauty in the eye of the beholder, but I think we all know what it means. And it doesn't mean using a sledgehammer approach to crush a peanut. So you have to be very careful how you do this. Years ago, it didn't matter because condos would rush to court or arbitration and get their costs. But in the last few years, courts have started to look at behavior. Again, it's consistent with the idea of it as a community. So,
and I'm going to backpedal just a couple steps. You had mentioned, the written communication that's going to be going out to this homeowner. So the property manager would write, reach out and figure out the best way to communicate with the homeowner, and to try to, if possible, de-escalate the situation so that it doesn't, because it could quickly escalate. If you are reaching out to legal, that legal letter does not have to go directly from the lawyer to the owner. It could first go to the board of directors for review to make sure that you are expressing the tone that you want, so that that legal letter is well received and does not escalate the situation.
That's a really good point, Shelley, because again, too often the letters are sent out by the lawyers in their normal course of business, and they're not actually customized to the dispute. And each conflict, each dispute has its own elements, and one size doesn't fit all in your approach to resolving.
Well, and I was thinking, Colm, while you were talking, a regular trap I have seen directors, managers, other owners, doesn't matter who, fall into is, well, you have this problem owner, let's say, like scare quotes, and now every time they complain about something, there's this human sort of reaction to want to write it off, right? Whereas I think, like you said, every conflict has to be judged on its own merits, or every dispute, or whatever the correct word is there. And that I have seen owners who, yes, they are more vocal than other owners about complaints. And maybe 90% of the time, the complaints aren't reasonable, but you still have to be careful, because 10% of the time, they might have a great point that you can't just write off simply because they have a reputation for being difficult. So I think that, directors and managers can both help with this by reminding themselves that you're playing, you want to play as an impartial role as possible in executing the corporation's duties fairly. And so, again, I just going to harp on that word reasonableness. And I like to think too, when I'm writing a letter or when I'm dealing with the situation or giving a board advice, I think, you know what, anything I write might come up at some other point. It might be discoverable in some other process. That's increasingly true these days. Would I feel uncomfortable defending what I'm putting down here to another person in the future, whether it would be a judge, an arbitrator, a mediator, or just another director maybe in the future, right? And I think that if you write with that in mind, you'll see the reasonableness start to appear in your communications, right? So write for an audience, even if there isn't one.
So Margaret had put a question in to Q&A asking, can directors, either two directors or the entire board, meet with an owner? In your experience, Gerry, what would you advise in this case? I guess it's all determines what the case is.
Yeah, so I generally don't like it when there is informal chatter between the board and a unit owner. Partially because, I mean, well, we've seen some court cases where that's gone very poorly. Directors have to remember that they can be construed as representatives of the condo, even if they're not thinking of themselves as acting in that function at that moment. But I do think that a formal meeting with an agenda, with a good idea of what you want to get out of that meeting, and with a lot of respect in the meeting, it can be very useful in some instances. You just want to be careful that, like you said, there's going to be a lot of context around any situation like this, right? So if you have a situation where you're worried about somebody saying something that will inflame the issue, well, maybe it wouldn't be the best option. But I can see a lot of instances where it would be helpful. And at the end of the day, I do have some sympathy with the idea that, I mean, the directors are ultimately responsible for how the condo runs. And so they must have some, the owners must have some way of accessing their board's opinion, and their board directly, ultimately.
Yeah, I mean, that's a very good question, because it's difficult to give a blanket answer. Many condos don't want their directors speaking to complainants. And I think if you follow what Gerry's saying, that you actually schedule it. This shouldn't be a chat in the parking lot or in an elevator. And I think it's a good idea to have your property manager there and have the agenda. But I think it's something you need to weigh out, because many of the disputes that I see, one of the big complaints of the unit owner is, I asked to speak to the board and nobody would talk to me. Right? So you may have a good reason not to, but unless there's a danger type of element to this, this is dangerous behavior, you really think about what you should be doing. Again, for the whole community, because the cost of going forward is high for individuals, and I'm not just talking financial costs, but it can really interfere with the way people relate to each other. And especially in smaller condos, that can be really crucial. So what Gerry said makes sense. Do it on a case-by-case basis, but don't do it in the parking lot or in an elevator.
Yeah. And another thing is too, I mean, sometimes the owner might just want to feel heard, or make sure that the board knows that what their concern is. So you can even have a meeting with the person where it's just fact gathering, right? And you let the board know, look, you're allowed to deliberate on this afterward, right? But at least the person will know that the board understands what they've said. So, but not to invalidate anything else I just said, but that came to mind.
And I think that kind of answers Margaret's other question too, about a formal meeting of quorum of the board. It doesn't have to be set out as a formal meeting. It could, it's a fact gathering, a meeting of both parties, and you can go from there. The board can go from there. But again, if there is a decision to be made by the board, then it must be a quorum.
If you go back to the old book Getting to Yes, which came out in the early 80s, became kind of the Bible of conflict management, dispute resolution. In it, it talks about separating people from the problem. That's exactly what Gerry said. Just because someone's complained before doesn't mean they're just a complainer. And one of the things that you'll find is communication fixes lots of things. Because when somebody says, I called the property manager, or I tried to call the board 3 times this week and nobody got back to me, they're basically really saying, do they think I'm no one? I'm not important? And that can take something that could be easily fixed into a totally different realm. So again, not one size fits all. Take guidance from your property manager.
Exactly. And one of the points that you had made, Colm, is pull people in. I thought that was a really good point that you had made about pulling people into compliance.
Well, yeah, because that's what we're looking for. We're looking for compliance. We want things sorted out. And, unless we're trying to essentially punish someone, we should not be pushing them. We should see what's reasonable, how can we work it out? And maybe you can't work it out, but I can tell you that the approach you take And like the letter Gerry mentioned that will be looked at by a judge or an arbitrator will have a significant impact on whether or not the condo gets its legal and arbitration costs or legal and court costs back. So, you know, we need to reframe this in terms of what are we trying to do? We're trying to bring about some kind of cohesiveness and compliance in the community, and pulling works better than pushing. And we all know that as individuals. When somebody pushes it, you push back. So this is a lesson we could take from employment law, is let's pull people in, let's give them warnings, let's give them opportunities. That doesn't mean you don't enforce compliance. It just means you take perhaps an extra step or two depending on what's involved in the non-compliance.
So is there ever a time when communicate is not the right approach? And that's where I believe that our question or a poll at the beginning, informal or formal, kind of comes into play as well.
Definitely. If there's a dangerous situation, then, you know, you can't spend the time communicating about it. You might, you know, you're going to send, your lawyer's going to get involved right at the beginning in something like that. Otherwise, you know, it's not going to get fixed quickly if it goes into mediation, arbitration, or court. So you can have lots of time to think about it, and you can always come in and out of a conversation to try and resolve things. But if there's a danger to the community or an individual, then, you know, you have to rely even more heavily on your professional advisors as to the route you should take to push this into a compliance. You know, pulling people in is for most stuff, but sometimes you really do have to, look at rights and look at law and look at enforcement.
Absolutely.
Right. I mean, so I agree completely. I mean, Colm, you alluded to the fact that sometimes you really can't work things out. Sometimes it is impossible, and we're not naive to that fact, right? And there are always things that you can over communicate that I wouldn't recommend. So for example, there are privacy laws. There are things you shouldn't disclose, even if doing that might resolve a dispute in the short term, right? So yeah, you do have to use some common sense about your communications. Another thing is the words "without prejudice" can sometimes be advisable. I mean, if you think that something is heading to litigation, you can still communicate in good faith, but you might not, there still might be certain things you don't want to say, or at least you want to make clear that you're saying it without prejudice. But I think in most instances, it's safe to say that communicating openly is the better solution.
Absolutely.
The whole without prejudice idea, that's been a heck of a long time since I was a lawyer, but just because you say it's without prejudice doesn't necessarily mean it is. So if it's important, run it by at least your property manager, run it by your lawyer.
Absolutely.
Because you don't want to say something and then say, oh, well, that's not what I meant. And it was, I didn't think they would be able to use it. So be careful with that. That's something you really do need to think about. Who's going to see it? Is that going to prejudice your case? And again, the person to ask is the property manager and the lawyer.
So
right.
Nicholas had a question as well about in the COVID environment, many condo groups or communities have created Facebook groups and to communicate and maintain a sense of community. If residents are complaining openly about non-compliance on this forum, does the board of directors have a duty to report or act on these forums? And that's a difficult question because it all depends on the circumstances.
Yeah, it does. It very much depends on the circumstance, I would say. And it also depends on what you mean by act on, right? I mean, it might be reasonable if, I don't know, I'm going to make something, maybe a stupid example up, Shelley, but if somebody says this person keeps, burning wood in their backyard, they have a fire pit and it's right next to the fence, it might be reasonable for the manager or a director to nonchalantly walk the property, assuming that you're not ruining anybody's privacy, to see if there is actually a fire pit there. I don't know that we have the duty to monitor a Facebook page, I don't know if that would be considered an actual report to the condo, but I don't think there's anything wrong with the manager doing something discreetly, as long as you're not like accusing somebody of it. And I think if you're just following the same steps from previously, you're probably pretty safe.
Yeah, to follow up on it, and if there is legitimate non-compliance issues, to follow up on them.
And there might be other things that are impossible to follow up on discreetly, in which case you may not want to actually, or you might recommend calling the police in many instances, if it's to do with, abuse of some kind or that type of thing that might be outside of the manager's really or director's purview.
One thing you don't want to do is engage in social media debates.
No.
Yeah,
because they're
absolutely.
not debates.
Yeah, no, very good point, Colm. So we've spent a bit of time talking about, and just looking at the timing, so we'll hurry along here, about talking about a lot of informal mediation and negotiation. But as far as the formal, I'm going to actually just launch our next poll, which is just to ask the attendees today, has your condominium, pardon me. No, for some reason I'm having issues here. So, well, I'll go ahead and ask the question, and if I'm successful with the poll, we'll launch that at some point. But the question was: has your condominium been involved in mediation, arbitration, CAT, or litigation? And so, Colm, I'll turn this part over to you, as far as if all avenues have been exhausted, and you did speak on this at the beginning about what are the options that are out there. So if you could, if the board has a difficult situation that they're dealing with, what are the options to look at?
Well, there are a number of options. I mean, we have do nothing. We have, mediate and arbitrate under Section 132 of the Act. We have bring a compliance application to court. And we also have the condo tribunal. So there's different bits here. And so if you get to the stage where you're thinking of going there, that's the time you need to bring your lawyer in, if you haven't already, because which of those pathways you go down can have a dramatic impact. And particularly in terms of costs, but just in terms of, do you really want your condo to be a reported case in law reports? Do you want it to be, critiqued, your behavior? So you get legal advice. And the legal advice, the questions you want to know is which path? Should we be mediating and arbitrating this? Because even if it isn't specifically covered in Section 132, you can mediate or arbitrate on agreement. And you can certainly mediate. Some people don't even like the term mediate. And so you might have a facilitated meeting. So you just look at how you would approach it. But it is something, because the consequences can be really serious, both in cost and in other kind of fallout. You really should get your lawyer to tell you what they think about the best route to go. My experience with condominium lawyers, as many of you would know, there are a limited number in Ontario who do a lot of the work. And I find for the most part, they are looking to problem solve and not get you into a major battle. But sometimes to protect the community, you do have to assert your legal rights. And the question then becomes, are you going to do that through court, the CAT, or arbitration? And it really does depend. I've seen cases go to court that probably should have gone through mediation because it could have been successfully resolved. I've seen cases go to arbitration that I've wondered as the arbitrator why I wasn't in court, but there's often a reason. But you do need advice on it. It's not something you just say, okay, we're going to do X. You need to know why you're doing X. And then, of course, now with the CAT expanding its jurisdiction, its powers into nuisance, noise, things like that, that's another issue. Is this a nuisance that is a danger as well? Because if that's so, then maybe you are going to be relying on courts still. The CAT has exclusive jurisdiction, but it doesn't necessarily push out some other considerations. So again, you need competent legal advice on this. And if your condo is not represented by a condo law firm, I can tell you after doing this for 20 years, you really should be, because most lawyers who don't work in the condo field don't understand the dynamics of it, nor the complexity of it, because it's a kind of a mixture of different areas. And, I'll be completely honest, the first one I did a long time ago is because one of my colleagues said, Colm, you like to do weird stuff. Do you want to do a condo mediation? And I went, what's that? Okay, so, generally that's the response you would still get from non-specialist lawyers. So you really need to get good advice, because the consequence can be horrendous. Hundreds of thousands of dollars, so which you probably didn't budget for. So you need to watch
that's
that.
That's a very good point as well, Colm, is that budgeting for not only legal fees, but professional fees. So whether it is use of the services of a lawyer, a mediator, an arbitrator, or additional services from your condominium manager, let's say if you were going to CAT, the tribunal, those are items that you definitely should be considering budgeting for. Gerry, I'm going to switch avenues a little bit here. So here's another scenario. We have contractor XYZ who has yet to address deficiencies for a contract that they have at the condominium corporation property, and directors are asking to have another contractor step in, rectify the deficiencies, and just get the job done. What would be your advice in this particular scenario?
Right. Yeah. Well, I see stuff like this on a semi-regular basis, and I also see a similar situation, or a situation that sometimes prompts a similar response, which is when like a unit owner damages a piece of the common element, maybe not beyond repair, but reduces it in value in some way. And then often I will have maybe even justly angry director or owner demanding that the contractor who has performed part of the work be not paid at all for the entire job, or payment should get withheld completely, or the unit owner who has damaged a portion of the common elements for whatever reason should be responsible for completely restoring that area of the common elements. And so I guess even here, I would like to just lean on this concept of reasonableness, right? Where, so if a contractor has successfully performed 3/4 of a job, and they've got some deficiencies, first thing to do is to ask them about it. I would talk to the contractor to see if they're aware of the deficiencies, if they agree that there are deficiencies, and if they're willing to fix the deficiencies, and be polite about it. And most of the time, contractors depend on repeat dealings and are happy to fix deficiencies, right? So I wouldn't jump to anger or accusations of bad faith about something like that. It's really good to have just a conversation with the contractor about it. And it's also important to remember that even if a contractor has failed in some way, it doesn't mean they can't fix their mistakes. So they should get the opportunity to, assuming they're willing, to fix their own errors prior to calling someone else in. Sometimes you can extend that courtesy to the example of the owner I gave that may have broken part of the common elements, and sometimes you can't because they might not be competent to fix what they broke. But in any case, I guess what I'm saying is things to keep in mind are don't go into it with bad faith and assumptions about why something was broken. Have a conversation to find out if there really is a problem that needs to be solved, or if the person is happy to fix whatever is reasonable, and firm up in your mind what is actually reasonable, right? I mean, if a person puts one dent in the wall, are they thus painting the entire hallway? Is that something that's reasonable? I don't know, it's tough, right? Or if the contractor does 95% of the job and they fail to do 5% of the job, and maybe there's a disagreement about that, are you withholding 100% of the payment? That's probably not reasonable either, right? So, yeah, I don't know if I completely answered the question you asked me, Shelley, but that's the sort of tact I would take going into something like that.
A lot of good points. Thank you, Gerry. No, it definitely hits on some realistic and points that I'm sure a lot of managers and directors that are online right now watching this webinar that you can relate to. Colm, I'm just keeping an eye on our timing here, and you had mentioned before going on the webinar that there is a publication that you were referring to that you would be posting on your website.
Yeah, I do training, and we have a guide to active listening, because when we get to the end of this, to me, the most important part of any kind of conflict management and prevention, which is what we're trying to say. If you're reasonable, you can prevent, manage conflict without it becoming, really a dispute that involves external parties. But the most important part for a board, for the property managers, lawyers, for everybody involved, is to actively listen. And part of that involves your attitude. And I think Gerry's point on, oh God, that person complains all the time, is a really, really good point. You have to want to actually sort things out and help. You have to respect the other person, even if you disagree with them, because they may have a reason, or they may not just understand. And if you personalize it, it'll get really bad. So you're not really there to judge or blame people. That's a role for the courts, the CAT, and arbitrators. So part of it is also your own knowledge. You need to know how you feel about conflict. If you're uncomfortable with conflict, then get your property manager or your lawyer, or bring in a mediator facilitator if you need it. And then you need skills, because my experience is if someone feels that they're understood and that you actually care about sorting it out, they will be much, much easier to deal with, because they realize you're listening to them and you're listening carefully, not just going and sitting there. So that's really the key to making a successful approach to informal conflict management and even beyond. So please try and do that. I'm going to put this up on my website. I'm in the middle of doing a redesign, so I'm not sure when it will go up, but if anybody really wanted, they can email me and I'll send it to them. So basically, I think we've all been trying to say, one size doesn't fit all. Think about what you're doing, and when in doubt, ask questions. Get outside help if you need it. Okay,
Perfect.
thanks.
Thank you, Colm. And Gerry, on those closing remarks from Colm, do you have any takeaways from today? There's lots of information that's been shared, but over to you.
Well, I don't want to repeat everything Colm just said, which I completely agree with. I think maybe I'll just say one quick thing that I was thinking about earlier when we were talking about getting legal advice, which is that I have the same experience as Colm, where I get legal letters from non-condo lawyers, and they're often not as good as ones that come from condo lawyers. And I would say, don't be scared to seek legal advice, really, because my experience with the condo lawyers, at least, I have experience with Ottawa lawyers and Toronto lawyers, it is almost overwhelmingly positive, actually. And I think a lot of the time I hear a lot of these same things from a lot of those lawyers about reasonableness. So yeah, I think listening to as many reasonable voices as possible is a good idea. I'll leave it there.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much again today for joining us, everyone, and for guest speakers today, Colm Brannigan and Gerry Bourdeau. Very interesting conversation, and please, everyone, join us next week on October 20th as we continue with this webinar series, part 2, which will cover safety in communities and some steps to take for community awareness as well. Thank you again, and take care and have a great day. Goodbye, everyone.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you.